Just short of a week after assuming the Liberal leadership, Susan Lee published an essay in The Australian this morning, spelling out how she will spend the next few months. She says, listening to the community and rebuilding our movement. Our policies, she said, are up for review, but our values are not. We will always stand, she said, for lower, simpler and fairer taxes, not as an economic ideology, but because we trust people to spend their own money more than we do the government. Now, all very sound lines from Lee. That lower, simpler, fairer line about tax was one that Tony Abbott himself came up with in the 2010 election campaign, and trusting people with their own money, well, that's classic Thatcher. So she's not put a foot wrong here in that sense. Lee also wrote about reviewing the party's commitment to its other core equity, along with sound economic management, and that's namely national security. Remaining steadfast in support of AUKUS and the AUKUS agreement, because we must have an urgent, honest conversation with Australians about the deteriorating geopolitical environment in our region. Now, good, what else? Lee also talked today about choice and education. Now, two things here that are important. Education, absolutely, but it's worth restating the obvious that the coalition, the Commonwealth, doesn't run a single school. The Commonwealth doesn't employ principals or teachers. So if it wants to get education right and get into the fight about education, well, the coalition's going to have to be willing to take on the issue about what our children are taught in school. And it's been a decade since the coalition was willing to do that. It should be willing to do that, but that's not been the experience to date. Also on choice, again, a good starting point for the coalition. But where were they on choice in childcare, for instance? In the campaign, rolling over and just rubber stamping Labor's annual $18 billion spend in this area, but doing nothing to give parents choices other than unionised childcare. As a former childcare minister herself, Lee should be willing to look at all the models that let parents choose the best sort of care for them, including options that allow them to use this funding to care for their own children in their own home and then adjust taxpayer support accordingly. Maybe that's what she hopes she'll do or will do. We can have fingers crossed on that one. 2 weeks on, though, it's pretty clear now why the Liberals sank to such a catastrophic loss. It wasn't because they were too right-wing or too left-wing, but because over the 3-year term, it's hard to say exactly where they stood on anything other than opposing the voice and supporting nuclear power. Now, both are great positions to have, but not nearly enough to be a clear alternative to a bad government. Take the government's greatest vulnerability. This is energy policy. Now, it was the government's epic failure to deliver on that promised $275 cut to power bills that was a big part of the cost of living crisis. To meet its emissions obsession, Labor mandated a renewables rollout that some experts have costed at some $1.5 trillion by 2030. Part of the Libs' problem was that they could never really decide whether they were for renewables or against them. So more importantly, whether they were for or against subsidising renewables. Because they really are as cheap as the government claims, then why do they have to be subsidised? Then there's the whole vexed question of net zero, which was Scott Morrison's captain's call before he flew off to the Glasgow Climate Conference in 2021. Now, I know some will argue that there is a reasonable long-term objective in net zero, but what's more important now in 2025, getting emissions down further and faster than anywhere else, or delivering affordable and reliable power? Now, I reckon this one's a no-brainer for the Libs. The immediate policy objective has got to be getting power prices down and ending the threats of blackouts, getting more gas into the system and keeping our coal-fired power stations open and operating so that industry stays in Australia and with it the jobs. The National Party, well, they're moving to scrap net zero. And given the view of former UK Labor Prime Minister Tony Blair, who says that net zero is doomed to fail, well, that's hardly a radical position. The Liberals, though, well, they've got a range of views.
There's no question emissions reduction is an important part of policy going forward because, I mean, energy is the economy and we need to get energy policy right. But there's no secret there is a divergence of views in our party room about how we achieve that.
The electorate has sent us a very clear message what it is that they want in their government. Abandoning net zero, I don't necessarily think is consistent with that.
We don't believe in groupthink. We believe in thrashing things out, and everybody should have a voice.
Then there's Labor's new tax on unrealised gains. Right now it's quarantined to superannuation accounts over $3 million, but it's not indexed. So eventually the number of people hit with this tax will be much greater than the 80,000 that Labor say are impacted now. But that's not the real issue. If this policy becomes law, it will be the first time in this country that people are taxed on the increased value of their asset rather than the profit they might make when the asset's sold. As every Liberal should know, taxing a profit that hasn't actually been made, taxing money that's not in people's pockets, well, that's wrong in principle. Again, it staggers me that the Libs didn't make more of this during the election. But even now, it shouldn't be that hard to work up a campaign against a tax that retail magnate Gerry Harvey calls, quote, stupidity of the highest order. If a grassroots campaign were to force the government to back down and junk this tax, well, that would clearly establish the opposition's comeback potential. Now, if it didn't, it would at least be a stick to beat the government with for the whole of this term. What Lee needs to do now is get her frontbench announced, get the names out there, the portfolios allocated, and get them working. Get the party-related reviews underway as well and start to establish her own political personality. Despite 24 years in the parliament, most Australians couldn't pick her in a lineup. Most journalists don't even know how to pronounce her name. It's Lee, as in key. Even a whole stack of MPs get that wrong. So she's got to get moving and not allow despondency to overwhelm the party. As big as the PM's majority is in the lower house, and it's a Labor record, the reality is that 7 out of 10 Australians did not vote for him. Given the government's shocking record last term, never underestimate Labor's propensity to stuff things up. As I always say, Labor is brilliant at the politics, but hopeless at government. So, Susan Lee will see.